The photograph is ordinary at first glance. A city street, stone buildings, iron lampposts. The caption reads simply as Market Square, Stockholm, circa 1890. No fire damage, no rubble, no scaffolding, and yet no people. The street is wide enough for crowds, and the architecture suggests a mature, highly developed city, not a frontier settlement. Census records from Stockholm list 250,000 residents by the end of the 19th century, but in the photograph there are no pedestrians, no carts, no vendors, only absence. The official explanation points to long exposure times. Early cameras required stillness, they say, so movement disappeared. But exposure times do not erase everything. They do not erase market debris, horses tied to posts, or children sitting still. This same emptiness appears in Paris, St. Petersburg, Chicago, and Melbourne. Different cities, same silence. If the streets were built for people who were not yet there, then what event cleared the world before it was repopulated? By conventional history, the Old World ended gradually. Wars swept across continents, plagues decimated populations, revolutions toppled monarchies, and industrialization transformed economies. Textbooks describe the 18th and 19th centuries as an era of rebuilding after medieval stagnation, where stone was replaced by brick, superstition by science, and darkness by enlightenment. The narrative flows smoothly from one century to the next. Census records appear reassuringly linear, showing European populations rising decade by decade, cities expanding outward, and trade routes multiplying. Everything progresses as it should. Yet, even in official records, strange footnotes appear. Margins note estimated figures without explanation, and whole districts are counted, then recounted differently a decade later with no accounting for the discrepancy. In isolation, this seems like bureaucratic imperfection, but together these records construct a world where change happened gradually and populations grew organically. A story repeated often enough becomes infrastructure itself, invisible, assumed, and rarely questioned. But continuity may be the assumption that fails. The earliest city photographs are treated as celebrations of progress, daguerreotypes of Paris boulevards, prints of Vienna, glass plates of Boston. These images appear in archives as evidence of civilization's triumph over chaos, yet they share a detail that rarely makes captions. They are completely empty. Broad avenues stretch toward vanishing points with no traffic. Government buildings stand with no guards visible at entrances. Commercial districts show shop fronts but no customers. Long exposure is the standard answer. People became ghosts, then nothing. This explanation satisfies initial curiosity, but it does not explain the absence of static life. Benches are empty when they should hold resting figures. Doorways are open but unoccupied. Market squares show stalls but no goods. Charles Marville's photographs of Paris, taken during the 1860s transformations, show entire neighborhoods cleared of habitation, street after street of finished buildings and completed infrastructure, all waiting in silence. Census numbers from the same period do not show equivalent displacement. If hundreds of thousands lived in Paris, where did they go during the day? If they existed, why does no trace of them appear in these thoroughly documented streets? The explanation breaks across hundreds of different photographers, different cities, and different continents. The camera did not arrive early to document empty streets. It arrived after something had already happened. Buildings are treated as witnesses to gradual human achievement, implying generations of coordinated labor, accumulated knowledge, and cultural continuity. Official histories credit specific architects and documented funding sources. These explanations satisfy until the timelines compress impossibly. Cologne Cathedral appears in records as begun in the 13th century and completed in the 19th century, 600 years of construction. Yet photographs from the 1880s show a stone precision and structural uniformity that suggests coordinated execution by a single generation working from a unified plan, not piecemeal accumulation across centuries. Chicago's civic buildings rose within years after the Great Fire of 1871. Structures exhibiting neoclassical mastery, normally attributed to Old World civilizations with centuries of stonework tradition, appeared in a frontier city barely decades old. Training does not explain instant expertise. Practice does not appear overnight, yet the buildings stood fully realized. St. Petersburg presents the same impossibility. Founded in 1703 on marshland, the city displayed an architectural sophistication within decades that rivaled capitals centuries older. Massive palaces, uniform boulevards, and coordinated infrastructure all appearing too quickly for organic development. Many architectural drawings in archives appear finalized after the buildings already stood, added to explain what had been found rather than to guide what would be built. Construction records describe adaptation more than creation, foundations described as reinforced that show no sign of prior weakness. The language suggests inheritance rather than invention. What if these buildings were not built by the civilizations that occupy them? What if they were claimed, renamed, and reinterpreted by populations that arrived afterward? Population records are expected to grow incrementally, but in city after city across the 19th century, the numbers refuse to behave. St. Petersburg nearly doubled between census counts in the 1840s without corresponding birth records or immigration documentation to explain the surge. San Francisco exploded in population after 1850, officially attributed to the gold rush. Yet early photographs show heavy infrastructure already sized for massive growth before the population arrived. American frontier towns repeat the pattern, showing populations in the hundreds, while photographs reveal civic architecture designed for thousands. A United States Census clerk noted in 1870 that population was likely undercounted due to displacement, but the phrase appears without context or explanation. European cities show similar jumps. The official explanation points to industrialization drawing rural populations cityward, but rural census records do not show corresponding depopulation. You cannot count people who do not yet exist, unless the cities were built first, waiting, and populations arrived later to fill spaces already prepared. Between the mid-1800s and the early 1900s, millions of children appeared in institutional records with no documented lineage. The orphan train movement alone, operating from 1854 to 1929, relocated an estimated 200,000 children from East Coast cities to rural communities across the United States. Intake logs repeat the same phrases across thousands of entries: origin unknown, parents deceased, details unavailable, found abandoned. Foundling hospitals in Europe reported unprecedented volumes during the same period in Paris, London, Moscow, and Vienna. The scale defies standard explanations of poverty or disease. The documentation consistently notes a total absence of origin, no home region identified, no prior residence recorded, and no extended family traced. Infant incubator exhibitions at World's Fairs displayed premature babies as technological curiosities, charging admission to view rows of infants in glass cases. These exhibitions also processed children with murky origins, providing institutional documentation where none existed before. A civilization rebuilding after gradual decline would preserve ancestry, and family records would survive. But a civilization repopulating after catastrophic loss would have no ancestry to preserve. It would begin again, with children who had no verifiable past, only institutional intake forms marking their entry into recorded history. A society of orphans is a society without memory. Who were these children replacing? By 1893, when the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition opened, it presented itself as a temporary marvel, a white city built to celebrate progress and then vanish. The fair covered 600 acres, featured more than 200 buildings, and attracted 27 million visitors over 6 months before its demolition. Officially, these structures were temporary, made of plaster over wooden frames. Yet photographs reveal foundations extending deeper than temporary structures require, sophisticated electrical systems, and hydraulic infrastructure indicating long-term planning. Exhibition logs describe buildings adapted for use rather than constructed from scratch, suggesting modification of existing structures rather than creation of new ones. The Paris Exposition Universelle of 1889 and the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair followed the same pattern, covering vast acreages with architecturally unified, structurally complete neoclassical buildings that were demolished within a year. Documentation describes these exhibitions as showcasing future possibilities, but the photographs suggest a different relationship to time, not futures imagined, but pasts remembered, not innovations displayed, but inheritances temporarily revealed before being dismantled and erased. If these were temporary exhibitions, why build foundations designed for permanence? Why such complete removal? The pattern holds globally. Temporary cities leave permanent questions. Why build civilizations twice, once for exhibitions and again for actual habitation, unless the exhibitions were not built at all, but rather revealed? The photographs return with different meaning now. New York, Moscow, Melbourne, Buenos Aires, different continents, yet the same stillness pervades the images. Broad streets extend into empty distance. In some images, a single figure appears blurred, a ghostly movement captured during long exposure. This proves the photographic technology could record motion as a blur, yet these isolated figures emphasize rather than explain the emptiness. One blurred person in a street designed for thousands makes the absence of others more conspicuous. Technical manuals from the period document that by the 1880s, snapshot photography existed, capable of freezing movement and recording active street life. Yet the empty streets persist across all these technological periods. Archival collections preserve thousands of these images, characterized by architectural presence and human absence. Some archives note the peculiarity in catalog descriptions, marking scenes as unusually devoid of inhabitants, with the cause unknown. If urban populations existed at the density census records claim, photographic evidence should reflect this reality. Instead, the photographs show prepared spaces, infrastructure complete, and systems installed, all waiting in silence. Modern explanations point to deliberate staging, with photographers clearing streets to capture buildings without obstruction. But this requires coordination across hundreds of photographers, dozens of cities, and multiple decades. It requires a unanimous global preference for emptiness over life. Absence is not nothing. It is a record of removal or of an